fabulous treasure the world has ever known. It's mine. Or
If you grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons in the late 1970s, there is a good chance the Fantastic Four holds a very specific place in your memory. The theme music, the animation, the way Marvel's first family felt genuinely larger than life on a small screen. But the story of how that show came together and how it came undone is one that most fans never got the full picture on. This is The Fantastic Four, 1978. How the 70s cartoon masterpiece fell apart. Segment 6. Marvel comes to Saturday morning. To understand what the 1978 Fantastic Four series was, you have to understand what Saturday morning television had become by the mid to late 1970s. By 1978, the three major American networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, were locked in fierce competition for the Saturday morning time slot. This was the block that mattered most to kids, and it was the block that advertisers were spending serious money to reach. Animation studios were being commissioned constantly, and the demand for content was high enough that corners got cut, deals got made quickly, and quality varied enormously from one production to the next. Marvel Comics had already been through one wave of animated adaptations. The 1967 Fantastic Four series, produced by Hanna-Barbera, had been a modest effort, serviceable if unspectacular, and faithful enough to the comics that fans recognized the characters. Then, in 1978, Depatie-Freleng Enterprises, a studio better known for the Pink Panther franchise, won the contract to produce a new Fantastic Four animated series for NBC. Depatie-Freleng was not the most obvious choice for a Marvel superhero property. The studio had built its reputation largely on comedy shorts and animated specials, not action-adventure storytelling. But they had the resources, they had the relationship with NBC, and they moved quickly into production.
Around.
He isn't clowning, Ben, despite what you think.
But there's no such place as the island he showed us.
Stan Lee himself was involved as a creative consultant on the project. His fingerprints were on the storytelling in ways that mattered, particularly in the selection of comic book storylines to adapt and in ensuring that the characters' personalities remained consistent with their printed counterparts. The series premiered on September 9, 1978, and it carried genuine ambition with it. The animation was smoother than many of its contemporaries. The stories drew from actual Fantastic Four comic book storylines, including some of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's most beloved material from the 1960s and early 1970s. Galactus appeared. The Skrulls showed up. Dr. Doom featured in multiple episodes. The Mole Man made an appearance. For a generation of kids who had no access to the comics themselves, this was the first time these characters had ever felt real on screen. The voice cast deserves particular attention because it was one of the show's strongest assets. Ted Cassidy, best known to audiences as Lurch from the Addams Family, provided the voice of the Thing, and his naturally deep, graveled delivery gave Ben Grimm a weight that the character genuinely needed. Gerald Moore voiced Reed Richards with a measured authority that suited the character well. Ginny Tyler voiced Sue Storm, and Frank Welker, who would go on to become one of the most prolific voice actors in the history of American animation, contributed a range of supporting voices throughout the run. The overall cast brought credible performances to their roles, and the production had a consistency that suggested Depatie-Freleng had taken the assignment seriously. For one season, it worked. 24 episodes aired across the 1978 to 1979 television season, and they reached an audience of children who would remember the show fondly for decades. The ratings were reasonable. The response from young viewers was genuinely warm. And then, almost before it had fully established itself, everything changed.
Ask for their help. Yes. Call the Fantastic Four. We all vote aye.
Segment 5. The problem nobody talks about. Human Torch was missing. Here is something that a lot of people who watched the 1978 series remember without necessarily being able to explain. There was no Human Torch. Johnny Storm, the youngest member of the Fantastic Four, the hothead, the one whose powers are visually the most spectacular, was completely absent from the show. In his place was a character called HERBIE, Humanoid Experimental Robot, B-Type, Integrated Electronics, a small, round, floating robot with a cheerful demeanor and absolutely none of the dramatic tension that Johnny Storm brought to the team. This required explanation, and the explanation that circulated for years was wrong. The popular story, repeated so many times it became accepted fact, was that NBC had refused to include the Human Torch because network executives were afraid that children would set themselves on fire trying to imitate him. It was a vivid enough explanation that people believed it without question. The image of panicked network executives banning a superhero for being too flammable became part of the show's mythology. The truth was considerably more mundane and more complicated. The actual reason Johnny Storm did not appear in the 1978 series was a rights issue. The Human Torch's live-action rights had been optioned separately from the rest of the Fantastic Four property. A live-action Human Torch project was in development, or at least being held in development, and as a result, the character was not available for inclusion in the animated series. Marvel and Depatie-Freleng worked around the absence by creating HERBIE as a replacement fourth team member.
There were strange, mindless creatures beneath the mysterious isle. But I can...
The fire safety story was eventually debunked by people involved in the actual production, including writer and editor Roy Thomas, who confirmed that the rights issue was the real explanation. But the myth had already taken hold, and it persists to this day in casual conversation about the show. The creation of HERBIE was itself a collaborative effort between Marvel and the production team. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had returned to Marvel briefly during this period, were involved in developing the character's look and basic personality. The result was a design that was deliberately friendly and unthreatening, round, small, with a face that communicated helpfulness rather than danger. In the context of a show already navigating network standards and the absence of its most visually dramatic character, HERBIE was engineered to be palatable. Whether he succeeded in that aim depended entirely on who was watching. Children who grew up with the 1978 series and had no prior attachment to Johnny Storm often accepted HERBIE without difficulty. He was simply part of the team, part of the show's world, and the affection many of those viewers developed for him was genuine. It was viewers who came to the show already knowing the comics, older siblings, parents who had read Fantastic Four in the 1960s, who tended to find the substitution unsatisfying. That divide between those who knew what was missing and those who did not was one of the quieter tensions running through the entire production. HERBIE himself became a minor piece of Marvel history, eventually making his way into the actual Fantastic Four comics in 1978, introduced in issue number 209, written by Marv Wolfman. He later died in the comics protecting the team, giving him a story arc the television version never had. Whether or not viewers liked the character, he became genuinely connected to the show's identity. For many people who watched in 1978 and 1979, HERBIE is simply inseparable from what that series was. But he was not the only unusual decision made during the production. He was, in a sense, a symptom of the larger set of compromises and complications that surrounded the entire enterprise.
There
escaping! Stop them with the stun beam!
Segment 4, Depatie-Freleng, the Marvel deal, and what happened next. Depatie-Freleng Enterprises had a productive relationship with NBC through the late 1970s, but the company itself was in transition. David Depatie and Friz Freleng had built the studio over more than a decade, primarily on the back of the Pink Panther and associated comedy properties. Action-adventure superhero animation was a different kind of production entirely, and the infrastructure required to sustain it was different too. By the time the Fantastic Four series was in its first season, Depatie and Freleng were already in discussions that would significantly reshape the company. In 1980, Marvel Comics itself acquired Depatie-Freleng Enterprises and reorganized it as Marvel Productions. This was a significant move. Marvel was not just licensing its characters to outside studios anymore. It was building the capability to produce animation in-house, with direct creative oversight over how its properties were being presented to audiences. The move made considerable business sense from Marvel's perspective. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the company had watched its characters be adapted by outside studios with varying degrees of fidelity and varying degrees of commercial success. Taking production in-house meant Marvel could control quality, retain more of the revenue, and build a library of animated content that it owned outright. What it could not do, immediately, was save the shows that were already in the pipeline and already struggling. This acquisition changed the landscape for everything Depatie-Freleng had been working on. The Fantastic Four series had aired its one season on NBC and had not been renewed for a second run.
Toulouse! Open the silo! Activate the nuclear missile!
The timing of the acquisition meant that the show existed in a strange transitional space. Produced by a studio that was in the process of being absorbed by the very company whose characters it had been animating. The cancellation after a single season was not entirely a surprise. NBC's Saturday morning lineup was competitive and constantly shifting. Shows that performed adequately, but not exceptionally, were regularly rotated out in favor of new properties. The Fantastic Four had done well enough to justify its one season, but had not made the kind of ratings impact that guaranteed renewal. There was also a broader context worth understanding. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw increasing pressure from the Federal Communications Commission around children's television. Advocacy groups like Action for Children's Television had been pushing for years to reduce advertising time during children's programming and to raise the overall quality of content being broadcast to young audiences. Networks were navigating these pressures carefully, and action-adventure animation, with its emphasis on conflict and super-powered combat, was not always the easiest content to defend to standards departments during this period. This was also the era in which the Saturday morning lineup itself was beginning its long, slow contraction. Game shows, live-action programming, and eventually news magazines would steadily encroach on the animation block across the 1980s. In 1978 and 1979, that process was still in its early stages, but the signals were already visible to anyone paying attention to the network landscape. None of these pressures alone canceled the Fantastic Four series, but together, they formed the environment in which a show with modest ratings, a missing main character, and a studio in transition simply ran its course and ended.
Uh-oh, more of them. I need a hiding place.
Segment 3, The Stories They Told. What the show actually got right. Before the conversation moves entirely to what went wrong, it is worth spending real time on what the 1978 series got right, because in several significant ways, it got a great deal right. The writing drew directly from Marvel's published Fantastic Four stories, particularly from the era that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had built in the 1960s. This gave the animated series access to a mythology that was already extraordinarily rich. The cosmic elements of the Fantastic Four's universe, the Negative Zone, the Skrull Empire, the world-eating scale of Galactus, were present in the show in a way that felt genuine rather than watered down. Specific episodes stand out as evidence of how seriously the production team took the material. The Galactus two-parter, The Menace of Magneto aside, the cosmic stories were where the show found its most distinctive voice. Stands as one of the more ambitious things attempted in Saturday morning animation during this period. Galactus as a concept, an entity so vast and indifferent that he simply arrives to consume worlds, not out of malice, but out of need, was not an easy idea to translate for a young audience. The character had first appeared in Fantastic Four, issue number 48 in 1966, part of the famous Galactus trilogy by Lee and Kirby, and even in the comics, his scale required readers to make a conceptual leap that most superhero stories never asked of them. The show handled it with a seriousness that respected both the source material and the young viewers watching at home. Dr. Doom's appearances were similarly well handled. The character's voice, the way his schemes unfolded across episodes, the particular combination of wounded pride and genuine menace that defines Doom in the comics. These qualities came through in the animated version in ways that later adaptations sometimes failed to capture.
Look, a foreign ship is landing.
Reed Richards, as portrayed in the series, was perhaps the most faithful animated version of the character produced to that point. The combination of scientific brilliance, emotional reserve, and genuine care for his family was present in the writing and performances in ways that felt earned. Sue Storm's role was somewhat constrained by the storytelling conventions of the era. Female characters in Saturday morning animation were regularly given less to do than their male counterparts, but within those limits, the character was handled with respect. The Thing, voiced by Ted Cassidy, was the emotional center of many of the best episodes. The internal tension of Ben Grimm's situation, a man trapped in a body that makes him look like a monster, who loves his team and yet carries a grief that never fully resolves, was present in the 1978 series in a way that went beyond what most Saturday morning animation attempted. Cassidy's natural gravitas contributed enormously. His performance gave Ben Grimm a dignity that the character deserved and that the scripts, at their best, supported fully. Beyond the cosmic storylines and the villains, the show was also quietly good at the interpersonal texture of the Fantastic Four. The relationship between Reed and Sue carried real warmth, even within the limited space that Saturday morning storytelling allowed. The team felt like a family, not just a group of people who happened to have superpowers. And that quality, more than any individual episode or set piece, is what made the show feel different from the other superhero animation airing alongside it. The animation itself, produced by a Korean studio under Depatie-Freleng supervision, standard practice for American animation budgets at the time, had a fluidity and visual consistency that held up reasonably well against the competition. The character designs were faithful to the comics. The action sequences were clear and well staged, and the color work gave the show a visual warmth that matched its Saturday morning context without undercutting the drama. By the standards of what was actually airing on Saturday mornings in 1978 and 1979, this was a production that genuinely cared about the material it had been given.
That's just what I intend to do.
Okay, little fella, here's your big chance.
Segment 2, The Shadow of What Came Before and After. The 1978 Fantastic Four does not exist in isolation. it sits between two other animated versions of the characters, and its place in that lineage shapes how it has been remembered. The 1967 Hanna-Barbera version was the first. Produced at a time when television animation was in a very different place, it was rougher, simpler, and more limited in its ambitions. The stories were functional adaptations of the comics. The animation was basic by later standards, and the overall production reflected the budget constraints of 1960s Saturday morning television. But it had introduced the characters to a generation of American children, and it holds its own nostalgic place in the history of Marvel animation. The 1994 Fantastic Four animated series, produced by Marvel Films Animation for Fox Kids, represented a significant leap forward in almost every respect. The animation was more sophisticated, the storytelling was more serialized, and the production had access to a Marvel that had been building its animation infrastructure for well over a decade since the Depatie-Freleng acquisition. The Human Torch was back, voiced properly, central to the team dynamics in the way he always should have been. The 1994 series ran for 2 seasons and is generally regarded as the most complete animated version of the Fantastic Four produced during the 20th century. By that point, Marvel Productions had become Marvel Films Animation, and the institutional knowledge built through years of in-house production was visible in every episode.
Men whisper in fear. The name of the Mole Man.
The 1978 series, sitting between these two, has sometimes been treated as the lesser version. Not as raw as 1967, not as polished as 1994, something that existed in a middle space without fully claiming its own identity. That reading is not entirely fair. The 1978 series was working within constraints that the 1994 series did not face: a different regulatory environment, a different animation infrastructure, a different understanding of what Saturday morning television could realistically accomplish. And within those constraints, it produced 24 episodes that held a generation of young viewers and gave them their first encounter with Galactus, with the Negative Zone, with the particular emotional weight of Ben Grimm's life. It is also worth remembering that in 1978, Marvel as a cultural force was not what it would later become. The comics were beloved by their readers, but the idea of Marvel properties as mainstream entertainment, as something that adults and children alike would line up to see, was still more than 2 decades away. The 1978 Fantastic Four series was reaching viewers who had no wider cultural framework to place it in. It was not a tie-in to a blockbuster film or a companion to a merchandise empire. It was, for many of its viewers, simply the show, the primary and sometimes only version of these characters they would ever encounter. That context gave it a responsibility that it took seriously, even if the production circumstances around it were complicated. The children who watched in 1978 and 1979 are now in their late 50s and early 60s. Many of them carry memories of the show with a specificity that speaks to how it landed at the time, as something that felt genuinely exciting and connected to something larger than the usual Saturday morning fare. That response did not come from nowhere. It came from a production that, for all its compromises, was genuinely trying to do something worthwhile with extraordinary source material.
Reed Richards into the plastic-skinned Mr. Fantastic.
Segment 1. Why it ended and what it left behind. The Fantastic Four, 1978, ended after 1 season, and the reasons were multiple and overlapping rather than any single catastrophic failure. The ratings were adequate, but not strong enough to secure renewal in a competitive time slot. The absence of the Human Torch, replaced by a robot invented specifically to fill a right-shaped hole, gave the show an unusual quality that some viewers found charming and others found baffling. The studio that produced it was in the process of being reorganized into a new entity, and the broader Saturday morning animation market was shifting in ways that did not favor action-adventure over the comedy and variety programming that networks were increasingly preferring. Depatie-Freleng became Marvel Productions in 1980, and the new entity turned its focus toward other properties: Spider-Man, the Hulk, and, eventually, the enormously successful Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which premiered in 1981. The Fantastic Four were set aside. Their animated presence paused for more than a decade until the 1994 Fox Kids revival brought them back with a considerably larger budget and a considerably more ambitious approach. What the 1978 series left behind is harder to measure than ratings or production schedules. It left behind a specific set of memories in a specific generation of viewers. The sound of Ted Cassidy voicing Ben Grimm, the visual scale of Galactus looming over a world too small to defend itself, the way the negative zone looked on a television screen in 1978 or 1979 on a Saturday morning, to a child who had never picked up a comic book and had no idea how deep and strange that mythology actually went. Ted Cassidy himself died in January 1979, just months after the series had aired, at the age of 46 following heart surgery. His death meant that even had the show been renewed, the voice that gave Ben Grimm such an irreplaceable quality would not have returned.
At my feet. Now, all that remains is to meet my...
That fact sits quietly alongside the other circumstances of the show's end, a reminder that some of what made the 1978 series what it was could not have been sustained regardless of ratings or network decisions. The show was not perfect. It was missing one of its 4 lead characters for reasons that had nothing to do with creative judgment. It was produced in a transitional period for the studio responsible for it, and that transition ultimately ended the production before a second season could be made. It aired in a television environment that was not always sympathetic to the kind of ambitious, mythology-heavy storytelling it was attempting. Herbie, for all the mockery he attracted over the years, actually outlasted the show itself in one important sense. The character was embraced by Marvel in the comics, appeared in merchandise, and was occasionally referenced in later Fantastic Four media in ways that acknowledged the strange piece of history he represented. He became a mascot for a very specific moment, a gap filler who took on a life of his own simply because the circumstances of 1978 demanded his existence. But it ran. It reached its audience. And it introduced an entire generation of American children to some of the most genuinely bold ideas that superhero comics had ever produced. Ideas about exploration, about loyalty, about what it means to be different in a world that does not always have room for the unusual. Those were ideas that the children who watched in 1978 and 1979 carried with them in many cases for the rest of their lives. That is the full story of the Fantastic Four, 1978. How the 70s cartoon masterpiece fell apart. The 1978 Fantastic Four is one of those shows that means more to the people who watched it at the time than it is often given credit for in the larger conversation about Marvel animation. It was a product of its moment, specific to the Saturday morning culture of the late 1970s, shaped by the constraints and compromises of that particular production environment. And it wore those origins honestly. It was imperfect, incomplete in at least one very literal sense, and it ended before it had the chance to become whatever a second season might have made it. But it existed. It aired, and for one season, It gave a generation of children something genuinely worth remembering. If this brought back any memories of Saturday mornings in front of the television, leave a comment below. We would love to hear what the show meant to you. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the cartoons, the stories, and the pop culture moments that shaped the world we grew up in.